Nordstream, a story which has only gotten more interesting by the day. Let's go and put this up there on the screen. In a news that will shock absolutely nobody, a Ukrainian military officer, quote, coordinated the Nord Stream pipeline attack. Roman Chernivsky, who was a colonel in the Ukraine Special Operations Forces, was, quote, integral to the brazen sabotage operation, say people familiar with the planning. Now, all of this is one of the most arcane, bizarre ways that we've finally learned the truth, because Chervinsky is now actually being prosecuted by the Zelensky government. And he is speaking out in this, I guess, a face-saving operation to try and to save his own hide by finally telling us the truth. The details, though, themselves, according to both him and many of the other intel officials and others who are familiar with the plan, is that this went, Krystal, all the way up to the very top of the Ukrainian military. It was overseen directly by the head of the Ukrainian armed forces. According to them, and as always, they're like, well, Zelensky had no idea about the operation. But the reason why we should really pay attention here is that the details on this show a highly coordinated special operations mission led by the Ukrainians to blow up the Nord Stream pipeline, where when you start to pair that with the past reporting that we've done here on the show, I believe Ryan was in for you at the time, was the level of entanglement between the CIA and the Ukrainians. That story, I now believe, was probably a precursor to releasing the details on this. And it basically described how CIA operations in Ukraine, specifically with their special forces, are unprecedented in the way that we have trained them, stood them up, basically running half of their operations for them, paying all of their salaries. We never even did anything like this like we did in Afghanistan or in Iraq, that level of support. Well, if you put that then together with this about these Ukrainian special operations forces, it's effectively impossible that the United States did not know. Now, the cope from the media and from the people leaking this is the U.S. intelligence community, quote, learned about it earlier and warned them not to do it. Well, that's one possibility. The other possibility is that that's all a smokescreen for we were actually the ones who directed the operation. But nonetheless, it raises several like crazy things. At the time, you had a lot of speculation that this was actually Russia. Obviously, there were tons of questions. Who can just, unequivocally come out with any evidence? The Biden quote was going around about, oh, Joe Biden says, we're going to make sure that we get rid of the Nord Stream pipeline. It's not going to be a problem. I forget the exact quote of what he said. But there was a plausible, I guess, scenario where this had been some sort of Russian operation. But as more and more details have come out, and as the longer the investigations have come, and basically been abandoned now by the West, and now intel been leaked, we have to grapple with this. Ukraine, at the very least, with U.S. support and possibly at U.S. direction, is responsible for one of the greatest acts of industrial sabotage ever. A bombing of a multi-billion-dollar pipeline system that also was used directly at the time to try to draw the United States into war. And these people are our alleged allies. More so, they put our diplomats, or maybe our diplomats were put in this position, again, we don't know who, where they blatantly lied to the American public and to the world about who was responsible for this. Here's a flashback. Let's take a listen.
The United States was not involved in any way. Period. The United States categorically refutes Russia's unfounded allegations leveled against us. The charges that have been made by Russians are just flat out wrong, plain and simple.
That is the Robert Wood. He was the alternate U.S. ambassador to the United Nations there at the time, responding there about our alleged involvement in the pipeline. President Biden also denied this from the White House podium at the highest levels of the Ukrainian government. So I don't know. I mean, to grapple with so many terrifying possibilities, that the Ukrainians clearly, we've always known this, they directly want to draw us into this war. But this was September 2002. September of 2022. The political conditions at that time were very different. This was an extraordinary event. That happened, and it was clearly they really wanted us to get involved. And again, the only reason we're learning the truth is because the guy planning the operation is now being persecuted by the Zelensky government. You can almost not make that up.
Yeah. And it's also important to keep in mind the context of like why they would want to do this. And it's not only to draw us into that wider war, but it was also to put a lot of pressure on the European populations, basically cut off the possibility that they could benefit from this pipeline. And so, I mean, it really was. Remember all the talk that we heard so much about, like, attacks on civilian infrastructure and how horrific that was and how brutal it was and what a war crime, et cetera. Here's a Ukrainian attack on a large piece and critical piece of civilian infrastructure. And we're just now learning, you know, more than a year later, what really we're learning what really happened here. And remember also the way that this all unfolded. First, they were very strongly suggesting, and the media basically ran with the assumption that, oh, it was Russia.
Yes.
Russia does terrible things. They did this thing. They blew up their own pipeline for reasons we don't really understand why, but they did it. It's definitely them. But we're not going to offer any evidence. And then it was like, and we don't really want to do an investigation either. This became increasingly untenable. And so then you had these suggestions of like, well, it might have been some Ukrainian partisans, but they definitely didn't have any connection. Zelensky had no idea. It was the Ukrainian Rotary Club, remember we were joking about out there. They were freelancing and he had no knowledge whatsoever. Now we get to, and the way that this was framed also in this article I thought was very interesting because the headline is about this Ukrainian military officer coordinated the Nord Stream pipeline attack. But really the headline here is that it was the top dude, the highest ranking military officer in Ukraine, who they're saying was in charge of the operation. So it went all the way up the chain as far as it could, but they go on to, but Zelensky still had no idea, which, as you pointed out, Saagar, either way is a terrifying possibility.
Yes.
So if you really have these people who are completely separate from Zelensky, freelancing, carrying out one of the most dramatic, episodes of industrial sabotage in world history. They're just over there freelancing and he has no control over them. That's terrifying. And the possibility that he was directly involved and behind it, and that, by the way, we were as well, is also quite something. So it is, I mean, this is a bombshell, astonishing report. And I also don't think it's an accident that comes so long after the fact when people have moved on and obviously attention is very much distracted right now by what's going on in Israel.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, look, it's convenient for them to forget, but it's one of those where we cannot forget, especially because we're watching in real time as everybody just like forgets that Ukraine ever happened, about all these most brain dead takes that I'd ever seen at the time, like, oh, the fate of democracy is at stake in Ukraine. Now they're like, well, maybe we'll have a peace deal. And it's like, oh, so is it realpolitik or is it not? Because which one? Those are totally incongruent. There's no actual, there's no overlap between those. So overwhelmingly, we are also watching the Ukrainian state, a month now starved of its blank check from America, basically disintegrating. You have the top military commander, who apparently was behind Nord Stream, who's like, it's a stalemate. It's a technological problem. As things are right now, nobody's going to win. Then you have Zelensky coming out literally begging for money, being like, listen, if you can't give us a check, like, we'll pay you back.
We'll take a loan,
like,
we're here for it.
You pay us back with what, you know? What exactly do you make again? Nothing? Oh, that's right. And especially now you lose 20% of your country. How exactly is that going to work? You can't even pay your own government salary. So it's one of those where he's in desperate straits. He refuses to abandon it. People in his team are admitting straight up corruption. Now his own political opponents are running against him. He's canceling elections. You have all of this consternation with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and all that that's now being scrutinized by America. I mean, it's a chaotic situation, which, let's be clear, it's actually been like that from the beginning. It's only now that you're allowed to talk about it.
Right.
And in that, we are, again, grappling with the fact that our supposed closest ally and all of that committed an insane act of industrial sabotage, dare I say even international terrorism, that would have had the biggest, like, they wanted to draw America into this war. They wanted to back the West up, into a corner to make sure they had no possibility of relying on, Russian energy and any of that in the future. And in my opinion, really what they did is that they just showed Western leaders and the population too, that in a clearest way, our interests are not the same, like at all.
Yeah.
Our interest is peace. Their interest is to draw us into this war, and let's just keep learning that lesson over and over again.
The last thing I want to say about this is, I mean, we really are watching the utter destruction of even a semblance of commitment to the quote-unquote international rules-based order. Like, this is collapsed completely in real time. And think about, just do a little intellectual exercise. if it was Russia that they could prove bombed the Nord Stream pipeline, think about how different they talk about it. If it was Hamas who managed to pull off such an act of international terror and industrial sabotage, think about the different way that they would talk about it. And so when you have the Russia war on Ukraine unfolding at the same time as the Israel war on Gaza, and you see so clearly that these rules are not rules, they're just applied selectively, weaponized against the countries that we don't happen to like. And it's so brazen, and it's so out in the open. I mean, this is the end of even being able to pretend that this country actually cares about such things. I just don't know how you even say it with a straight face going forward. And I really do think, I mean, you know, there's been lots of things you could point to, but in the modern era, it really starts to come unglued with the Iraq war and the bullshit pretext we used to go in. And, you know, it's no accident that Putin pointed to the Iraq war and what we did there as his excuse for why it's okay for him to do what he does. Netanyahu uses the Iraq war and the toll that took on civilians as his excuse to do what he's doing in Gaza. And Saagar, I think you're absolutely right that while look, I'm not going to deny there were horrors that we committed during the Iraq war, the number of civilians killed and the torture and Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay, like it really does pale in comparison to what is unfolding in Gaza right now. But we started this unraveling in the modern era with the Iraq war. And now we've just seen a complete dissolution of, like I said, even the ability to have a pretext of commitment to these supposed higher values. And, you know, it's an extraordinary and horrifying thing to watch in real time.
Yes, absolutely.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.